Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about an analogy I like to use for training and weight training sessions, but really this could apply to any sort of training, not just resistance training. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. All right, we always hear people say things like, when you are training, every training session is like a brick and a wall, right? Every training session is like a brick and a wall. And so you're building this wall. And again, it's built upon each brick. So each training session cumulatively over time builds this wall. And that would be well and good if the human body was a stagnant object. So it's an interesting analogy, but it's not really an accurate analogy, is it? But it can be one. And I think the way to look at it, if you want to make it an accurate analogy, is to understand that number one, the human body is a dynamic organism, right? It's continually changing. Number two, you detrain from every single training session that you do. In other words, given enough hours or days, 100% of everything that you ingrained and trained from a training session will disappear. It will disappear. So the way to think about it that's a little bit better is visualize each training session being a brick in the wall, but the bottom bricks are decaying and crumbling and crushing under the weight, right? They are crushing under the weight. And so when we start thinking of things like hypertrophy, right? Your overall muscle size, your performance, different performance elements, that is the wall that you're building. And you know, a different type of brick or different color of brick in that wall might be represented by the different training effect. You know, how much neuromuscular efficiency did it have? What movement patterns was it associated with? Joint angle specificity. And then the size of the bricks themselves would be the hypertrophy and growth. And so if you think of it in this manner, if you have all the bottom bricks, so the further they are down the wall, are being crushed at the bottom layer and crumbling apart under the weight of the wall as it goes up, that's a more accurate analogy. And so if you visualize that, think about it this way. The heavier the wall gets, the faster the bricks underneath start to decay because there's more and more weight pressing down on them, crushing them apart, breaking them apart. So that might be that they're being crushed and falling out of the wall. Out of the bottom is just powder or whatever. So that the wall itself is continually shrinking. The wall itself is continually shrinking because that is what muscles do, don't they? Every muscle cell in your body is actually shrinking all the time. And the more muscle you have, the faster they shrink. So, you know, we always say things like, well, you know, we gain muscle slower over time. Well, is it because training produces less growth? It's not that training produces more growth. It's that the larger the muscle is, the more your body kind of wants to get rid of that muscle mass. In other words, your body wants to keep you from starving to death. It wants to keep your metabolism from getting too high. We're really designed to survive ice ages and famines and things like that. And so that's why we have things like myostatin that will inhibit a lot of these things, but a lot of that has to do with more catabolism. In other words, your body does have more propensity for catabolism and muscle breakdown the more muscle you build. And so the way to think about it is it's as if the extra weight of the wall is crushing down more and more on the ones at the bottom. And so you have a continual decaying process or a regression or detraining process happening the further back you go in time, which means further down the wall. So in order to continually make the wall get bigger, you have to train and add bricks at a rate that is faster than the weight that they're doing, that they're creating is pushing down what the wall with. So in other words, you have to find a way to add bricks faster than the bricks are being crushed at the bottom. And there could be periods of time to where in your training and everything else going in your life that you're not capable of adding new bricks to the wall at a faster rate than the ones underneath are being crushed. So we have a very dynamic situation happening. And that really, I think, is a good analogy for explaining the opposing forces of anabolism versus catabolism. And understanding the fact that the more muscle we gain and the more performance we gain, the harder it is to increase it, right? It becomes way more difficult, and we gain slower. No matter what you do, the more performance, the more strength, the more hypertrophy, all of these things that we gain, it becomes exponentially more difficult to add more and more. And it's because you're fighting with the fact that the more you have, the more you are losing. So a wall that's being crushed underneath the weight from above explains that better. And that I think that would be a better representation. And then we have to look at the fact of then you got all these different colored bricks. Well, what do we know from training and weight training and everything else? We know that when you periodize training, for example, and you run different phases of training, you do get better at certain things the more recently you've trained them, right? In other words, you get better at lifting maximum weights during phases in which you are lifting heavier with the lowest reps. We know that muscular endurance tends to develop more, obviously, during the phases where you're doing higher reps, like muscular strength endurance. And it's not to say there isn't a massive overlap between the two, because there is. I mean, improving your 1 rep max can improve your work capacity. Doing higher reps, if you're gaining muscle and doing enough training volume, can increase your 1 rep max. It's just that they're not as specific. Then we'd start looking at things like motor patterns, joint angle specificity. If you have periods of time to where you're training the squat a lot more, your squat is going to tend to improve. And then if you start training the squat less and maybe focus on a different lift, that will regress sometimes more and another lift will go up. So that represents that the more recent bricks you've added to the wall will impact the wall more at this given time, because you'll have more of that type of brick in the wall, and the further back a different type of brick is down the line, as you detrain all of that, those are the bricks being crushed. Those are the big bricks being crushed to the point to where they are no longer part of the wall. And in other words, the more recent a training session is representing a brick in the wall, the more pertinent it is to your current abilities, results, everything else. That will be what's most relevant to all of your performance elements, which is what the wall is constituted of. So if we think of it that way, that the size of the bricks overall represents your overall hypertrophy, and the size of the overall wall, which is your body, your musculature, is represented in that way. But each individual brick, the type of brick, the color, everything else about it, would represent the performance elements, and that will be the makeup of the wall, the makeup of those muscles. Whereas in the size of the wall is just the size of the muscles. And again, if we understand it from that perspective, that it's continually being crushed, and the older bricks are the ones that are disappearing at a higher rate, and again, you'll have more disappearance further up, because if the weight is crushing further down and it gets taller, obviously other bricks will be damaged that are a little further up the bigger the wall gets. So they're continually disappearing and sloughing off. They're no longer part of the wall. So that also lets us understand how things like periodization, peaking cycles, and training, everything else work to constitute what the current consistency of the wall is, irrespective of what the size is at any given time. And I like that analogy better. Is it a very complex analogy? Yeah, but it does make sense, and I think it's one that people can understand who might be struggling to visualize the whole stress recovery adaptation cycle, to understand the balance between muscle growth and muscle breakdown. And I think that's a better analogy. So in other words, it helps reinforce the fact that of diminished returns, that again, the larger the wall gets, the larger your muscular gets, the faster it's breaking down, and the harder it is to add the same amount of height. To add another 3 or 4 inches of height to that wall, the bigger it gets, requires a lot more work, and it's going to be slower, because that is also speeding up the breakdown process further below because of the weight of it pressing down. And it again highlights the importance of currently peaking towards a given performance endeavor versus detraining towards that given endeavor. Because again, the older the bricks are in the wall, the more they're broken up and the less relevant they are, and eventually they will completely go away, and what will only matter is the bricks that you've added most recently. And I think that really properly reflects how, again, things like periodization and different focuses in your training work at any given time. So we have to understand that the wall that you're building with these bricks of training blocks, right, that it's a very dynamic, continually changing wall, just like, because the human body is a dynamic, continually changing organism. It's not a stagnant, stationary thing that once you add stuff, it is there. No, it's changing every minute, every second, every day. It is changing and evolving. So again, think of it as that wall that's crushing under its own weight, and you have to keep adding those bricks. And it also explains, to help people understand the constant struggle and the journey and the continual journey involved with training, with your muscularity, with your performance, with your strength, all of these things. It's just a better way to describe the wall analogy. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.